So now we're going to have to look at what tax rates have been historically and what they are at the moment. So prior to World War One, so 1914, right? The UK are all different levels, whether it's national, county, or local, right? The amount of tax revenue that they have as a percentage of GDP was there about 10%, right? And in the US, when you take national, federal, state, and local, it was about 7% of GDP, right? Obviously, World War One kind of like sparked like an increase in government spending and therefore in taxation. But then by 1930, you could see it was around, I believe, 23% in the US. 23% in the UK and about 14% in the US, right? Or thereabouts. So what we start to see as time goes on is this expand. With World War II, with the creation of the welfare state in both countries, etc., etc. So you end up having a situation now whereby the UK government, at all different levels, taxes 37% of GDP, and the US tax roughly about 33%. So all these figures were from 2019. All the the recent figures for 2019. Okay, obviously with the current crisis and everything's all kind of out. Those figures will be very different. But so if you think about it, that is a significant amount of the economy. That's slightly over a third of the economy being taken as tax revenue, right? So in Britain, that's £803 billion. That's B, not million, B. And in America, it's $7 trillion, right? So that's 7 with 12 zeros after it, okay? So that's a significant amount. So if we think about that, how does that vary from one country to the next, right? So if we look at some countries, right? Some countries have far more taxation than that. So a lot of places are a lot more like social democratic, a lot more kind of left wing on economics, one could say. And so they have a higher level of tax and a higher level of spending than us, maybe about 40%, maybe 50%, right? And then you have other places that are developing nations whereby there's lots of levels of corruption, lots of levels where it's difficult to collect taxes and stuff. So the level of taxation and spending is relatively low in a lot of like these underdeveloped places. And then you have a lot of places in the Far East, right, and many other kind of places like this, where you have developed economies, such as Singapore, like Hong Kong, China, Japan, etc., etc. These places have very like well developed like kind of like nations and stuff, but they have relatively low levels of tax and relatively low levels of government spending. China like their income tax is comparable to ours, but it's but by and large the amount of money that's being taxed and the amount of money being spent is very different from how we'd see it in most Western places. And also as well, a notable example is Switzerland, which taxes and spends less than like most of their European counterparts, right? So when we ask about how much the government should take, it really depends on what kind of economy we have and more importantly, what we expect our government to do with that tax revenue. So hopefully on screen at the moment, you should be able to see we have a PowerPoint presentation, right? So this will show different marginal tax rates. Like kind of over time in both like the US and the UK and stuff, right? And so you'll see how over time the top rate of tax has changed in these places, over a period of time. So you kind of see that prior to World War II, it's relatively like low levels of taxation, and then like the top rate of tax in many places goes up and up and up, all the way to when you start hitting like the 1950s and 1960s, a lot of countries have the top rate of tax being about 90%, right? So this doesn't, just to not scare you guys, right? That doesn't mean that 90% of all income that you make is taxed at 90%, it means that 90% of everything you make above a certain rate is taxed at that amount. So for instance, if you had a 90% tax rate on £1 billion, right? And if you're earning £2 billion, that means that everything above that first billion, ends up being taxed, right? So whereas everything else will be taxed at hopefully a lower rate. So that will give you some kind of indication. So don't panic, like when we say these high figures, like that's kind of what they mean, right? And obviously there was like plenty of loopholes and exemptions, etc., etc. So people rarely kind of paid those things. There was a very complicated tax code in those days. So if you were in the know and you were well connected, you could easily kind of get out of paying those higher rates. When we look, for instance, at what the best rate of tax should be, that itself sounds like a very simple question, but actually it's a very complicated one, right? And that is influenced by something we refer to as the Laffer curve, right? So here's a very simple demonstration. So if we had so if we're talking, for instance, you could use this for any taxation here, but if you want to use this just simply for income tax, right? If you had the income tax at 0%, right? There might be some people who might want to give some level of money to the government, but it would be, the amount of revenue you get would be probably near zero. Okay, we can think about it in that terms. Then, if we say on the flip side, 100% of the money that you earn is going to be taxed by the government, right? Now, there still would be some people who work because they just like working, etc., yeah. But at the end of the day, we work to put food on our like shelves and to kind of have a good living and stuff, right? So for most people, if they're taxed at 100%, they're going, I'm not working, that's long. Like, the government's just going to take all my money, why would I go to work, right? So if we think about it in this terms, right, so we understand that at some point, if it's zero, then the level is going to be like it's going to be near zero in terms of the amount of revenue you get, and if it's 100%, it's going to be near zero, right? So we know at these two extremes that there's some sort of like thing, right? So the Laffer curve basically says that somewhere in the middle, right, there's a point at which we can have a tax rate which maximizes the amount of revenue you get, right? So, and this issue has been very hotly debated over the years, right? And so some people say that it's a lot lower, some people say it's a lot higher, some people say it's somewhere in the middle, right? So in reality, right, it's a thing of, we have to really also bear in mind this, right? So the amount of wealth held by the top 10% in Britain and America is more than all the wealth and all the income earned by the bottom 90%, right? So if we think about it in those terms, yeah, it's a thing of, so when we say we're taxing people, realistically we mean we're taxing like slightly over half of it is the top 10%, right? The top 50%, yeah, they pay about 90% of the taxes, yeah, in the country, right? So, that bottom 50% is about 10%, right? So, and, as you go further and further along, like, it becomes even less so until it becomes negligible. And the reason for this is because if people are earning below a certain threshold, yeah, we don't tend to tax them, or we tend to tax them at a very low rate, because we understand that the amount of money that they don't have much disposable income. They don't have much money that they can spend on things, right? And so if you tax them too much, then they won't have enough to actually be able to live. Whereas someone on a very high income, you should be able to take like relatively more money from them because they've got more money to fall back on, so they should be all right. Like, so think about it very simply, $100,000 to Bill Gates is a drop in the ocean, right? £100,000 to you or me is going to be a significant amount, right? So this is why we have to like kind of rethink about how we administer our tax rates, and this is where the marginal tax rate comes in. So when you have, it's at 0% up into a certain threshold, then it's 20% above a certain threshold, and then it's 40% above a certain threshold, etc., whatever it is, right? So that's that's kind of how we kind of like do our like, that's how taxes are actually administered in this country, and well across many other places. So if we're looking at the Laffer curve and we're trying to work out what the ideal rate of tax would be, what the best thing to do would just be to look at the evidence of the last like 70 years, right? So shortly after World War II, like we said, like kind of you had top rates of tax around like above 90%, right? Then in about like the mid 60s, it drops to about 75%, and then with the event of like kind of the Reagan presidency and Thatcher premiership, we end up seeing rates fall down to about like kind of 40%, and in some cases, and for some years like lower than that. So for thereabouts, right, we start to see that actually the amount of revenue we end up getting ends up being very, very small in terms of, like, you would think, logically speaking, yeah, you would think that having a, like, if you ask someone, right, what would like produce more revenue, yeah, a top rate of tax at 35% or at 70%, right? And you obviously say, oh, 70%. But the thing is, it kind of, as we can see, it kind of plateaus, right? It doesn't significantly go up, and this is a problem that the French government had a few years ago. They elected someone to be president, and he came in saying that it was going to be at 45%. So it was at 45% at that time, and he wanted to raise it to 75%, and people thought that there would be a whole lot more revenue because you've just raised the top rate of tax by 30%, right? So but in reality, what we find is that the amount of revenue was not nearly as much as they thought that it would be. And so if you're thinking about it in those terms, it's just by raising the top rate of tax doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get that extra revenue. So if you looked at taxes in terms of raising revenue, we can see that it kind of plateaus at a certain point, right? And so there's no magical number. As within the social sciences, this is something that people tend to struggle with, right? So in STEM subjects, so like science, maths, like engineering, etc., right? We think of exact things, we think of exact numbers, if you ask a question, there's an exact answer, right? In the social sciences, because you're dealing with millions and millions of human beings who are all very complicated and different, etc., right? There's no magic number, right? So you can't say that the Laffer curve is at 40% or at 50% or at 60%, etc., right? It's a thing of anywhere within that range, you're going to realistically generate the same level of revenue, and there's a whole bunch of different other factors that go into it, which no doubt in the comment section, people are going to be lighting up saying, there's that, like you didn't take into consideration that, or right? You're not dealing with an exact science, right? And so you just have to kind of take it as a whole and as a rough average and be like, it is somewhere between 35% and 75%. And you're not going to like it, but it's somewhere within that range.